No one wanted the girl at the end of the auction. The announcement echoed across the vast chamber as the final wave of buyers filtered out through the glowing archways of Orion Exchange Station. The place still smelled faintly of overheated circuits and recycled air, the kind of scent that clung to every frontier trading hub on the edge of civilized space. Rows of empty bidding seats curved around a circular platform in the center of the hall, their holographic panels slowly dimming now that the event was nearly over. For the last 3 hours, merchants, collectors, and corporate envoys had competed for rare creatures and exotic labor contracts from half a dozen systems. But now the lights above the platform shifted to a dull amber glow, signaling the end of the catalog. Almost, because one figure still stood alone beneath the fading spotlights. She was taller than most of the others who had passed through the stage that evening, her posture straight despite the quiet restraint cuffs around her wrists. Her skin carried the soft blue tone common among the distant Varus sector, catching the overhead lights with a faint, glass-like sheen. Strands of dark silver hair framed a face that revealed nothing. No fear, no plea, not even curiosity. The auctioneer adjusted the collar of his coat and cleared his throat, clearly eager to finish the night. Lot 312, he announced to the half-empty room, his voice projecting through the chamber's sound grid. Species origin, Varan lineage. Behavioral profile, uncooperative. Historical record indicates repeated refusal to accept ownership agreements. A few tired buyers glanced back toward the platform, but quickly returned to their conversations. The reputation of this particular listing had already traveled through the station long before the auction began. The girl didn't follow commands. She didn't adapt. She didn't bend. The auctioneer spread his hands with a thin, almost apologetic smile. In simpler terms, he added, she is considered untamable. Somewhere in the back row a quiet laugh slipped out, followed by the scrape of chairs as the last cluster of bidders stood and headed for the exits. Above the platform, the station's environmental vents hummed softly, carrying the distant rhythm of docking traffic through the metal walls. The alien girl remained perfectly still. Her eyes, clear and bright like distant starlight, watched every movement in the room with calm indifference, as if she had already accepted the outcome hours ago. Most auctions ended with cheers, arguments, or hurried paperwork. This one ended with silence. The clerk beside the auctioneer began closing the digital ledger. Looks like we're finished, he muttered. No offers. But just as the final confirmation tone chimed across the hall, a single voice drifted up from the lowest row of seats. Calm. Unhurried. Human. Hold on, the voice said. You never told us the price. The auctioneer paused mid-motion and looked down toward the nearly empty audience. One man remained seated near the edge of the platform shadow, leaning back in a worn jacket that had clearly seen more star systems than most travelers ever would. His hair was light brown, his expression relaxed, and the faint dust of long-distance travel still clung to his boots. The auctioneer blinked in mild surprise. Sir, the auction has concluded. The man stood slowly, stretching his shoulders as if he had just finished a long flight. Yeah, he replied casually, glancing toward the girl on the platform. But you've still got one item left. The girl's eyes shifted for the first time that evening, settling on him with a sharp, measuring focus. The human stepped forward into the light, hands resting loosely in his pockets. Name's Ethan Cole, he said. And I'm curious. The auctioneer hesitated. Curious about what? Ethan tilted his head slightly toward the silent alien girl standing alone beneath the fading lights. How much? He said quietly. For the one nobody else wanted? The auctioneer stared down at the lone bidder for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether the human standing in front of him was serious or simply tired from a long day of trading. The Great Hall had already begun its shutdown cycle. Overhead lights dimmed to a softer glow and maintenance drones floated quietly along the upper rails collecting abandoned bidding tablets. Around the chamber the last merchants drifted toward the exits, their conversations echoing faintly against the polished metal walls. Ethan Cole remained where he stood, hands resting loosely in the pockets of his travel jacket, as though he had all the time in the galaxy. On the platform above him the alien girl had not moved, yet her attention was now fixed entirely on him. The auctioneer exhaled slowly and tapped the console beside him. A holographic panel flickered back to life, displaying the final listing that everyone else had ignored. The official reserve price was never set, the man admitted. Most buyers preferred not to involve themselves with a complicated asset. Ethan gave a small nod, glancing briefly around the emptying hall. Complicated usually means expensive, he said. But it also means nobody else wants the paperwork. The clerk beside the auctioneer leaned over the console and whispered something under his breath. The auctioneer considered it for a moment, then turned back toward Ethan with a thin shrug. 500 credits, he said at last. Transfer of custody, no guarantees, no liability agreements. She leaves the station with you, and the matter is closed. A few of the remaining staff exchanged puzzled looks. Even for a frontier station, that was an unusually low price for any living being listed in the catalog. Ethan did not seem surprised. He reached into his jacket and produced a small credit chip, holding it between two fingers. 500 credits works for me. The clerk quickly activated the transaction terminal, and the chip disappeared into the slot with a soft click. A moment later, the console chimed once, the sound crisp and official. The deal was complete. The auctioneer gestured toward the platform where the girl still stood beneath the fading lights. Ownership transfer confirmed, he announced automatically. Lot 312 is now registered under Ethan Cole, independent civilian operator. For a brief second, the hall grew quiet again. Then the restraint cuffs around the girl's wrists unlocked with a faint mechanical hiss. She did not step forward immediately. Instead, she studied Ethan from across the platform with the calm intensity of someone measuring a stranger they had not expected to meet. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried easily through the silent chamber. You should know something, human. Ethan looked up at her, one eyebrow lifting slightly. That sounds like the beginning of a warning. The girl tilted her head, silver strands of hair catching the station lights. Every buyer before you believed they could control me. Her eyes remained steady, clear, and unafraid. Every buyer before you was wrong. A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face, the kind of relaxed expression that came from years spent traveling difficult corners of the galaxy. Good, he replied calmly. Because I did not come here looking for something to control. He turned toward the exit corridor that led to the docking bays and motioned casually with his hand. Come on, he added. My ship is about a quarter-mile down the docking ring, and the station charges extra if you stay parked too long. The alien girl remained still for one more moment, as if considering whether this was another trick waiting to unfold. Then, without another word, she stepped down from the platform and followed the human who had just bought the one thing no one else in the entire auction hall had been willing to take. The corridors of Orion Exchange Station stretched nearly half a mile along the outer docking ring, a long curved artery of steel and glass that hummed quietly with the distant pulse of engines arriving and departing beyond the hall. Ethan Cole walked at an easy pace beneath the overhead lights, his boots striking the metal floor with the calm rhythm of someone who had spent most of his life on stations like this one. Behind him, the alien girl followed without speaking, her footsteps nearly silent despite the steady stream of cargo haulers and maintenance carts passing through the corridor. Outside the panoramic windows, the blackness of space unfolded in every direction, scattered with distant stars, and the slow drifting glow of merchant vessels waiting their turn to dock. Ethan paused briefly near a navigation display mounted on the wall, glancing at the station map, before continuing toward docking bay C-17. The alien girl watched him carefully, studying every movement as though trying to understand the strange logic behind them. After several minutes, she finally spoke, her voice calm but edged with suspicion. Most buyers speak very quickly after they leave the auction hall. Ethan glanced back at her over his shoulder. About what? About the rules, she said simply. What I must do. What I must become. Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. Well, that explains why you look disappointed. The girl narrowed her eyes slightly. Disappointed? Sure, Ethan said as he kept walking. You gave that whole warning speech back there, and I did not respond with a speech of my own. For the first time since leaving the platform, the alien girl seemed uncertain how to respond. She walked beside him now rather than behind him, her gaze moving between the passing travelers and the human who had just purchased her freedom, without acting like someone who owned anything. You paid 500 credits, she said after a moment. Humans usually expect something in return for money. Ethan shrugged lightly. Most species do. They passed beneath a large overhead sign that read Docking Ring C in bright, white letters. The corridor here was quieter, the hum of the station softer as they moved farther from the central markets. Cargo drones floated slowly between the loading doors while a pair of mechanics rolled a tool cart across the floor 30 feet ahead. The alien girl studied Ethan again with careful attention. "Then what do you expect?" she asked. Ethan stopped beside a sealed airlock door and tapped a small code into the control panel. The display blinked green, and the heavy door slid open with a smooth hydraulic whisper. Beyond it rested a compact starship with a weathered hull and faded markings that suggested years of travel through systems far from the polished trade lanes. Ethan gestured toward the ship. "I expect my engines to still work when I leave this station," he said casually. The girl did not move toward the ramp yet. Her eyes searched his face with the same quiet intensity she had shown in the auction hall. "You understand something, human," she said slowly. "I did not lie earlier." Ethan leaned lightly against the railing near the ramp. "About being untamable?" She nodded once. "About escaping." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The station lights reflected softly across the metal hull of Ethan's ship while a distant transport vessel drifted past the observation windows nearly 200 yards away. Then Ethan pushed away from the railing and walked up the ramp toward the airlock entrance. "Good," he said simply. The alien girl blinked once, clearly not expecting that answer. Ethan keyed the hatch open and stepped inside, pausing only long enough to glance back down the ramp. "Because if you were easy to keep," he added calmly, "everyone in that auction hall would have tried a lot harder to buy you." The interior of Ethan Cole's ship carried the quiet atmosphere of a vessel that had traveled far beyond the busy shipping lanes of civilized space. The lighting inside was soft and warm, reflecting off panels that had clearly been repaired more than once over the years. A faint scent of engine coolant and recycled air drifted through the narrow corridor just inside the airlock as the hatch sealed behind them with a gentle metallic click. The alien girl stepped carefully onto the deck, her eyes moving across every corner of the small cargo bay with the alert focus of someone who had learned never to assume a new environment was safe. Crates were stacked neatly along one wall, each labeled with faded shipping codes from different star systems. A compact tool bench occupied the opposite side, its surface covered with carefully arranged instruments that suggested Ethan spent as much time repairing his ship as flying it. Ethan moved past her without hesitation, crossing the bay toward the cockpit ladder while shrugging out of his worn jacket and tossing it casually over the back of a chair. The engines beneath the floor emitted a low, steady hum that vibrated gently through the metal deck plates. "You can relax," Ethan said over his shoulder. "The ship does not have any security restraints or hidden cages." The alien girl remained near the airlock for several seconds longer, as if verifying that statement for herself. Her fingers brushed lightly along the wall panel beside her, tracing the seams of the metal surface before she finally stepped farther into the room. "Most buyers say something similar," she said quietly. Ethan climbed halfway up the ladder leading to the cockpit and paused, looking down at her with mild curiosity. And then they explain why I am wrong." Ethan nodded once, as though that confirmed something he had already suspected. He disappeared briefly into the cockpit before the glow of several control panels flickered to life above. A moment later his voice drifted down again, calm and practical. "If it makes you feel better, you are free to leave whenever we open the hatch again." The alien girl looked up toward the cockpit entrance, clearly not expecting that response. "You would allow that?" Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair where he could see her from the upper deck. The cockpit window framed a wide view of Orion Exchange Station outside, its curved docking ring stretching nearly 300 yards across the starfield beyond. Cargo ships drifted slowly through the traffic lanes while distant thrusters glowed like tiny orange stars against the darkness. "Allow is a strange word," Ethan said. "You are not cargo." The girl's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "You paid." "For me." "Technically," Ethan replied, reaching over to activate the ship's navigation console. "I paid the station 500 credits so they would stop arguing about what to do with you." The engines beneath the floor vibrated slightly louder as the ship's systems completed their startup cycle. A soft computerized voice announced clearance preparation in the background. The alien girl moved slowly toward the base of the ladder, studying the unfamiliar controls and glowing displays that filled the cockpit above. "Where will you go?" she asked. Ethan considered the question while adjusting a small dial on the control panel. The navigation map shifted across the main screen, revealing dozens of star systems scattered across several sectors of space. "Honestly," he said after a moment, "I was planning to leave this station, find somewhere quiet, and repair a sensor array that has been malfunctioning for the last 2 weeks." The alien girl stared up at him as if the answer had not matched anything she expected to hear. "That is your plan?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Right now it is." Outside the cockpit window, the docking clamps released with a distant metallic echo. Ethan's ship drifted slowly away from the station, its engines glowing softly as the starfield expanded across the glass. The alien girl watched the massive structure of Orion Exchange Station recede into the distance, its lights fading as the ship moved farther into open space. After several seconds, she spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "Human," she said slowly. Ethan glanced down from the pilot's seat. "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment as the stars reflected faintly in her blue skin. "You are not behaving the way a buyer should." Ethan turned the ship gently toward the open trade lanes ahead. "That is probably because," he said calmly, "I never wanted to be a buyer in the first place." The ship moved steadily through the quiet darkness between star systems, its engines producing a low continuous vibration that echoed softly through the hull like the distant sound of thunder. Inside the cockpit, Ethan Cole adjusted the navigation controls with the calm precision of someone who had flown the same type of vessel for thousands of hours. The starfield beyond the windshield stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of white points drifting slowly past as the ship settled into a stable travel lane. Below the cockpit ladder, the alien girl remained near the base of the steps, studying the interior of the ship with careful attention. The soft glow of the control panels above illuminated the faint blue tone of her skin, while reflections from the stars outside shimmered across the metal walls of the cabin. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sound inside the ship was the gentle hum of the life support system and the occasional quiet click of Ethan adjusting a switch. Eventually, the alien girl broke the silence. "You said earlier that I was free to leave," she said. Ethan leaned back slightly in the pilot's seat without turning around. "That is correct. Then why have you not asked my name?" Ethan finally glanced down toward her with mild curiosity. "Would you like me to?" She seemed to consider the question carefully before answering. Most buyers demand it immediately. Ethan smiled faintly and rested his elbow on the arm of the chair. "That sounds less like curiosity and more like inventory management." The alien girl studied him for a moment longer before speaking again. "My name is Lyra Vera." Ethan nodded once, as if acknowledging something simple and important at the same time. "Lyra," he repeated. "That is a good name." She tilted her head slightly. "You did not ask what my species designation means." Ethan shrugged lightly. "If you want to tell me, you will." Lyra stepped up onto the first rung of the ladder, moving closer to the cockpit so she could see the wide window that framed the endless starfield ahead. From here, the station they had left behind was no longer visible. Only open space remained. "Vera is not only a species name," she said quietly. "It is also a lineage." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Lyra continued after a short pause. "My people once governed a group of star systems nearly 200 light-years from here. Our ships controlled trade routes that many civilizations depended on." Ethan whistled softly under his breath. "That sounds like a difficult position to maintain." Lyra's expression did not change, but there was a distant weight behind her voice when she spoke again. It did not last. The navigation console emitted a soft tone as the ship completed its departure vector and began accelerating through open space. Ethan adjusted the throttle slightly, guiding the vessel toward a distant cluster of stars nearly 12 light-years away. "Empires rarely do," he said calmly. Lyra's eyes shifted toward him. "You do not seem surprised." Ethan leaned forward to check the engine readouts. "I have traveled long enough to see how history usually works." For several seconds, the cockpit remained quiet again, while the ship continued its smooth climb through the trade corridor. Lyra rested one hand on the edge of the ladder railing, her gaze fixed on the glowing constellation ahead. "The people who captured me believe the same thing," she said slowly. Ethan glanced down at her again. "That empire's end?" Lyra shook her head once. That the last member of one could be sold like a discarded tool. Ethan studied her face for a moment, then returned his attention to the navigation display. Well, he said quietly, they were half correct. Lyra frowned slightly. Half correct. Ethan pointed through the cockpit window toward the endless field of stars stretching across the darkness. Empires do end, he said. But people are not tools. The ship continued its steady journey through the silent corridor between star systems, its engines glowing softly against the endless darkness outside. In the cockpit, Ethan Cole monitored the navigation panel while the stars slowly shifted across the wide glass viewport, like distant lanterns drifting through an ocean of night. Below the cockpit ladder, Lyra Vera remained still for a long time after his last words, her eyes reflecting the faint blue light of the instruments. The idea that someone could look at her without seeing an object or a prize seemed unfamiliar to her, almost like a concept from a forgotten language. The quiet hum of the ship filled the space between them while the vessel accelerated toward the next waypoint, nearly 12 light-years away. Finally, Lyra climbed the rest of the ladder and stepped into the cockpit beside the pilot's seat. From this angle, she could see the entire navigation display, a glowing map of star systems scattered across the sector. Where are we going exactly? She asked after a moment. Ethan tapped the console, and the map zoomed outward to reveal a small system highlighted in soft white. A place called Karina's Reach, he replied. It is a mining outpost with a repair dock and a diner that makes surprisingly good coffee. Lyra blinked slowly as if that answer had not been what she expected from a human who had just purchased the last survivor of a fallen royal lineage. You are traveling 12 light-years for coffee. Ethan smiled faintly. And to repair a sensor array that keeps misreading asteroid fields as cargo ships. Lyra folded her arms and studied him carefully. You continue to behave as if nothing unusual has happened. Ethan leaned back in the pilot chair and glanced toward her. I bought a passenger at a station auction. In my line of work, that barely makes the top 10 unusual things this year. Lyra was silent for several seconds before speaking again. You understand that the people who sold me will eventually realize what they lost. Ethan nodded slightly. That thought crossed my mind. When they do, Lyra continued calmly, they may attempt to find me again. Ethan reached forward and adjusted the flight path by a fraction of a degree. The ship responded smoothly, its engines shifting tone as the stars ahead realigned along a new course. Lyra, he said after a moment, there are more than 400 billion stars in this galaxy. She watched him carefully, and Ethan pointed toward the endless field of lights beyond the glass. That is a lot of places to disappear. Lyra looked out at the stars again, but this time her expression carried a hint of uncertainty rather than quiet defiance. For most of her life, escape had meant running from one cage to another, one owner to the next. The idea of simply traveling somewhere peaceful seemed almost impossible. Why are you helping me? She asked softly. Ethan rested one hand on the console and considered the question for a moment. The glow of the instruments reflected faintly across his face while the ship continued forward through the silent darkness. Because someone should, he said simply. Lyra searched his expression as though trying to detect some hidden motive behind the answer, but she found none. The human pilot only looked tired, calm, and oddly sincere. Outside the cockpit, the stars stretched across the universe like scattered sparks from an ancient fire. For the first time since leaving the station, Lyra allowed herself to imagine something she had not considered in many years. Not survival, not escape, but possibility. And the strange human flying the ship seemed perfectly comfortable carrying both of them toward it. The ship had been traveling for nearly 3 hours when the quiet rhythm of the cockpit changed. The engines continued their steady hum, but a soft alert tone suddenly chimed from the navigation console, sharp and unexpected against the calm background noise of the vessel. Ethan Cole immediately leaned forward in the pilot's seat and tapped the control panel, bringing a secondary sensor screen to life. Outside the cockpit window, the stars still stretched peacefully across the darkness, but the instruments now displayed a faint signal blinking near the edge of their scanning range. Lyra Vera noticed the shift in his posture at once. She had spent enough years surviving in uncertain places to recognize when a room became tense before anyone spoke a word. What is it? She asked quietly. Ethan studied the display for a few seconds before answering. Probably nothing serious, he said, though his voice carried a little more focus than before. The sensors picked up a ship entering the corridor behind us about 200,000 miles back. Lyra's gaze moved toward the glowing radar grid where a small light pulsed slowly against the digital map. Is that unusual? She asked. Ethan shook his head slightly. Not really. Trade lanes are busy places. He adjusted the sensor sensitivity and the display zoomed outward, revealing the distant vessel traveling along the same route. Although, he added calmly, most ships pass through these lanes much faster than this one is moving. Lyra stepped closer to the console, her eyes narrowing as she studied the faint signal. You think they are following us? Ethan shrugged lightly, though he did not take his eyes off the screen. It could be coincidence. He tapped another command, and the ship's communications system scanned the surrounding frequencies. The speakers remained silent except for the faint static of distant transmissions bouncing across the sector. Or, he continued, someone at Orion Exchange Station might have noticed that their least popular auction item left with a human pilot who does not usually visit that station. Lyra's expression became thoughtful rather than fearful. You said there are 400 billion stars where someone can disappear. Ethan smiled faintly. There are. He nudged the throttle forward, and the engines deepened in tone as the ship increased speed slightly, drifting farther along the corridor between stars. The sensor screen updated again, and the distant signal adjusted its course to match. They're heading. Lyra watched the change carefully. That ship altered its vector, she said. Ethan nodded once. I noticed. For a moment neither of them spoke. The cockpit lights reflected softly across the glass, while the vast universe continued to stretch endlessly ahead of them. Finally Lyra looked at Ethan again. You understand that if they believe I am valuable, they will not stop easily. Ethan leaned back in his chair and folded his arms loosely while studying the sensor screen. Lyra, he said calmly, do you know what the most common job is for humans who travel the frontier systems? She shook her head slightly. Ethan gestured toward the stars ahead of them. We fix problems, he said. Broken ships. Broken trade routes. Broken plans. The distant signal continued blinking steadily on the radar display, still following several 100,000 miles behind them through the quiet darkness of the corridor. Lyra watched the small pulsing light for a moment longer before returning her gaze to Ethan. And what happens when the problem decides to chase you across space? She asked quietly. Ethan turned his attention back to the controls and gently adjusted their course toward a nearby cluster of stars glowing faintly 12 light-years away. His voice remained relaxed, almost amused. Then we reminded, he said calmly, that the galaxy is a very big place to try and keep track of one small ship. The sensor alert continued blinking quietly on the navigation screen as Ethan Cole guided the ship deeper into the empty stretch between major trade routes. The distant vessel remained behind them, still several 100,000 miles away, but adjusting its course each time Ethan altered his own trajectory. The stars ahead shimmered across the cockpit window, stretching into a faint arc where the next star cluster waited nearly 12 light-years away. Lyra Vera stood beside the console with her arms folded, watching the small signal on the radar grid as if it represented a question she had been expecting for a long time. The ship itself remained calm and steady, its systems humming with the quiet confidence of a vessel that had traveled many difficult routes before this one. Ethan tapped another control, and a secondary display opened showing nearby navigation options across the sector. We will reach the outer boundary of the Carina corridor in about 40 minutes, he said casually. Lyra tilted her head slightly. And the ship behind us. Ethan glanced briefly at the blinking signal. Still there. The light on the screen pulsed again, patient and persistent. Lyra studied it with calm focus rather than fear. Then it is not coincidence, she said softly. Ethan nodded once. Probably not. He reached forward and adjusted the engine output, and the ship responded with a deeper vibration as its speed increased slightly. Outside the cockpit, the starfield stretched into long streams of light as the vessel moved faster along the travel lane. The signal behind them also increased speed, matching the change almost immediately. Lyra observed the adjustment with quiet understanding. They know who I am, she said. Ethan leaned back in the pilot chair again, resting one hand on the armrest while watching the display. That would explain their determination. Lyra turned toward the viewport, and looked out at the endless field of stars, her expression thoughtful rather than afraid. When my people governed the Vera systems, we were known for many things, she said slowly. Trade, navigation, diplomacy. Ethan listened without interrupting while the engines continued their steady rhythm beneath the deck. But there was one belief our leaders held above all others, Lyra continued. That dignity could not be purchased. Ethan glanced toward her briefly. Sounds like a useful philosophy. Lyra nodded once. That is why the people who captured me were so eager to sell me. The radar signal blinked again behind them, slightly closer now as the pursuing vessel narrowed the distance through the dark corridor of space. Ethan studied the display for another moment before entering a new series of commands into the navigation console. The main star map shifted suddenly, highlighting a dense cluster of drifting asteroids nearly 800,000 miles to their left. We are leaving the corridor, he said calmly. Lyra looked back at the screen. Is that wise? Ethan smiled faintly. It depends who you ask. The ship tilted slightly as the engines redirected their thrust, and the stars outside the window slowly rotated while the vessel turned toward the darker region of space. The radar signal behind them reacted almost instantly, adjusting its course again to follow. Lyra watched the maneuver with quiet curiosity. You said earlier that humans fix problems, she said. Ethan nodded while guiding the ship toward the shadowy field ahead. That is correct. Lyra glanced once more at the blinking signal pursuing them across the map. And this, she asked calmly, is your solution. Ethan rested his hand on the throttle and guided the ship into the first drifting shadows of the asteroid field where thousands of massive rocks floated silently through the darkness like ancient monuments. His voice remained relaxed and steady. Not exactly, he replied. This is just the part where we make things a little harder to predict. The ship slipped deeper into the asteroid field as Ethan Cole guided the controls with careful precision, the engines lowering to a quiet, steady pulse, while enormous dark rocks drifted slowly past the cockpit window. Some of the asteroids were no more than 30 feet across, while others stretched nearly half a mile wide. Ancient fragments of a broken world that had been orbiting this region for millions of years. Their surfaces reflected faint starlight as the ship moved between them like a shadow gliding through silent ruins. On the radar display behind Ethan, the blinking signal of the pursuing vessel entered the outer edge of the field only minutes after they did, its course shifting again as it tried to follow their path through the maze of drifting stone. Lyra Vera stood beside the cockpit window watching the dark shapes slide past the hull, while the faint glow of the navigation panels reflected across her blue skin. They did not turn away, she said quietly. Ethan gave a small nod while adjusting the thrusters to slide past an asteroid nearly 100 yards wide. No, he replied calmly. They did not. The ship banked gently around a cluster of smaller rocks, its hull passing within 50 feet of one massive formation that drifted silently across their path. Lyra glanced down at the radar again, where the pursuing signal was still blinking steadily. If they continue following us into this field, she said, their pilot must be very confident. Ethan smiled faintly as he reduced the engine output even further. Confidence can be useful, he said, but patience is usually more reliable. The vessel drifted quietly between two towering asteroids that nearly blocked the starlight completely, plunging the cockpit into a deeper blue glow from the instrument panels. Ethan tapped another control, and the ship's main engines slowly powered down until the only sound inside the cabin was the faint whisper of the life support system. Outside the window, the stars returned, scattered between the enormous floating rocks like distant lanterns in a dark ocean. Lyra watched the radar screen carefully. The signal representing the other ship continued moving deeper into the asteroid field, still searching for them along the route they had taken earlier. But Ethan's vessel now floated silently in the shadow of a massive rock nearly 300 yards long, its sensors reduced to minimal output while the hull blended into the darkness. Several minutes passed before Lyra spoke again. They cannot see us, she said softly. Ethan shook his head slightly. Not if we remain quiet. The distant signal moved slowly across the radar grid, drifting farther away as the pursuing ship followed the wrong path deeper into the field. Eventually, the blinking light faded toward the far edge of the display until it disappeared entirely beyond the scanning range. The cockpit remained silent for several more seconds while the asteroid shadows moved slowly around them. Finally, Ethan restarted the engines at a low level and guided the ship gently away from the rock that had hidden them. The stars outside the cockpit window brightened again as the vessel turned toward the open space beyond the asteroid field. Lyra looked at him with a different expression now, one that carried less suspicion and more quiet understanding. "You did not fight them," she said. Ethan shrugged lightly while the engines returned to a steady hum. "Sometimes the best solution is simply leaving the problem behind." Lyra turned toward the stars, stretching endlessly ahead of them, as the ship accelerated once more toward the distant system of Carina's reach nearly 12 light-years away. For a long moment, she said nothing, only watching the quiet universe unfold before them. Then she spoke again, her voice softer than it had been since the auction hall. "My people once believed that strength meant control," she said slowly. Ethan glanced toward her briefly before returning his attention to the navigation display. Lyra continued while the starlight reflected across her eyes. "But perhaps strength is something else." Ethan smiled faintly as the ship moved forward into the vast, open darkness where billions of stars waited beyond the next horizon. And for the first time since the auction ended, Lyra Vera did not feel like someone who had been bought. She felt like someone who had finally been allowed to begin again.